Ok, muito boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindos à primeira conferência de 2025 do Instituto de Estudos Medievais. É com muito prazer que recebemos o professor Simon Doubleday. É nosso conhecido, é nosso amigo, já pertenceu à nossa comissão de avaliação externa, conhece bem o nosso instituto e é por isso com redobrado prazer que nós hoje o recebemos. O professor Simon Doubleday é reconhecidamente um especialista na história medieval da Península Ibérica. Enfim, poderia falar dos muitos seus livros que tem publicado, particularmente naquilo que se refere à história da Galiza e à história do início dos reinos peninsulares e particularmente com foco na área social e na área política, em particular também nas várias famílias que estiveram envolvidas em todo o processo de formação também destes reinos e à sua atuação. Interconecta diretamente com Portugal, com o território português, antes da nacionalidade e depois da fundação de Portugal, porque está aí também as suas origens, e por isso é com muito prazer que nós hoje o recebemos. As portas do Instituto estão sempre abertas para o professor Simon. Certamente virá mais vezes ter connosco, já que vai estar cada vez mais perto, mudando-se agora para o seu foco de estudo, para a Galiza, e portanto este é um dos primeiros momentos que nós teremos, e portanto the floor is yours, Simon. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado. Thank you, Katarina. Thank you, everyone, for joining in person and online. And I will now endeavour to work all of this technology which is confronting me on the desk. But it is an immense pleasure to be here in Lisbon today, especially on a day in which there has been a minor earthquake. I do think the gods planned this very carefully, and it was particularly exciting to be able to witness that in the middle of lunch. But it's a great pleasure to be here once again, having just travelled from New York and yesterday from Santiago de Compostela. My sincere thanks to Catarina Tente, to the Instituto, and to the FCT, and all of you here today in person and online. Never has there been a more important time to support the humanities and history, which serve partly as a means of resistance to the imposition of dangerous values and false political narratives. The United States, as we say colloquially, appears to be heading south, that is, heading downwards towards a future of failure and falsehood, if not fascism. It may not be alone. I am slightly jet-lagged, but the journey from the beleaguered United States to northern and western Iberia, and occasionally further north to England, has been a hallmark of my professional life. It would probably be true to say that the intellectual triangulation between these 3 points continues to shape and inflect it in numerous ways. I'm going to see if I can make the PowerPoints magically move forwards.
Or not.
Or not. And the answer appears to be no. Already you have the magic touch. Voila. As I was saying, it would probably be true to say that the triangulation between these various geographical points continues to inflect my professional life in innumerable ways. I say probably because one of the most famous of all historical textbooks, E.H. Carr's What is History, memorably states, "It may be a fact that I went to London last week, but you would not ordinarily call it a truth. It is devoid of any value content." Such trivial autobiographical details, he means, are hardly the preserve of history. Still, his word ordinarily is doing a lot of work. He too, I think, would accept that the location of the historian and his or her inevitable subjectivity is a fundamental dimension of our craft, one that molds our frameworks of value and meaning. It's worth noting that the battle for political and ethical values mattered a great deal to E.H. Carr, whose early career developed at a time when totalitarianism was on the march across Europe. For Kant, facts do not become historical truths until precisely they are embedded in a set of meanings and values. Values without mooring in fact, on the other hand, are not yet truths. He writes, when the founding fathers of the United States in the Declaration of Independence referred to the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, you may feel that the value content of the statement predominates over the factual content and may on that account challenge its right to be regarded as truth. Indeed, at a time in history, the year 2025, when the values of the Constitution are coming to seem more and more like an optimistic assertion of values, and when the legal equality of human beings is being widely challenged, violated, and erased in the United States, this ostensibly self-evident truth appears to have been laid bare as a subjective, optional, and sadly contingent reading of the facts. For Kant, real truth, historical truth, lies, and I quote, somewhere between the North Pole of valueless facts and the South Pole of value judgments still struggling to transform themselves into facts. This is one of the directions in which our journey today will take us, a journey towards the north of factual realities in relation to medieval peninsular history, including some overlooked, buried, or understated realities. Facts which must nevertheless be inflected and informed by value judgments, some of which I will make transparent. It will, in that sense, be a journey to a kind of conceptual north-northwest. It will also be a journey to a geographical north-northwest, in particular to the territory known in various forms and with various meanings as Galicia. Before we begin, it may be worth remembering that all journeys are, of course, coloured by the accounts of previous travellers, the ghostly presence of previous generations of scholars and other intellectuals shapes our attempt to understand the historical past. We operate within the rhetorical and linguistic parameters they set. The title of my talk today partly echoes a line from Shakespeare's Hamlet, whose protagonist, having seen the ghost of his late father, is concerned with establishing the truth of his death. His search is made possible by his passionate grief. His own mother and stepfather accuse him of madness, but they are mistaken, he says. I am but mad north-northwest. When the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw. In fact, I would suggest that Shakespeare's play is at least as much about political illness as mental illness. Then, as now, something was, after all, very rotten in the state of Denmark. It would also be remiss not to mention the ghosts of Alfred Hitchcock. His 1959 film, North by Northwest, which revolves around a case of mistaken identity, is very much concerned with the elusive search for truth. The lead character, a marketing director played by Cary Grant, begins the film with glib disregard for objective fact. In the world of advertising, he says, there's no such thing as a lie. There's only expedient exaggeration. This gives way rather quickly to a determined effort to hunt down the real government agent for whom he has been mistaken, when he's kidnapped and horrifyingly taken to Long Island, of all places. His escape and his journey to Chicago, and then on the now defunct Northwest Airlines to South Dakota, take him eventually to Mount Rushmore. It is here, by the way, that our current master of falsehood, Donald Trump, now plans to add his own likeness in stone. The spectral presence of an unnamed totalitarian regime, presumably the Soviet Union, is clear throughout the film. Our hero's search for truth is also an effort to ensure the survival of his values. My presentation today will share with the film a concern with precise location, landscape, and geography, forms of physical as well as historical truth that keep us grounded, and with the attempts to ensure some kinds of marriage between truth and values. One of my concrete goals will be to suggest that between the 11th and the 13th centuries, the geographical northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, including Galicia, was more fundamental and more central to the Christian kingdoms and for longer than has often been acknowledged. Stated differently, the presumed periphery was central for a very considerable time. This may not be a revolutionary idea. It is intended simply as an inflection of some earlier narratives, but it may lead us in some interesting directions. I will aim very roughly for the impossible truth of the impossible north, I should say, of factual certainty. But the journey will again be inflected and informed by a number of subjective, democratic values, which once more are under siege. In early 2018, I was sitting in my office on Long Island, surrounded by bureaucratic forms. At the time, I was chair of the department. It was a relief to open an envelope addressed to me in an intriguing, unfamiliar handwriting. I quickly discovered that it was a letter from Bernard F. Riley, then Professor Emeritus at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. Riley, I'll point out in passing, was a determined voice against US imperialism and in the 60s and 70s against the war in Vietnam. He was a World War II veteran who had risen to the rank of corporal during the war in the Philippines. After the end of the war in East Asia, he went on to participate in the US military occupation of Japan and later remarked that the US bombing of the Japanese mainland and the nuclear holocausts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had made him a pacifist. In later decades, he would retain a vigorous skepticism towards US foreign policy, which he described in his self-published memoirs as the major threat to the welfare of the globe. In his letter, Riley explained that he had written a manuscript on the reign of Fernando I, of the kingdom that he called Leon Castile. But this manuscript, which ran at the stage in question to several hundred pages, had encountered some problems. The external readers at the University of Pennsylvania Press, tasked with evaluating the quality of the manuscript, had apparently not fully appreciated the core arguments that he wanted to make. They had proposed sweeping changes, and the magnitude of their suggestions was daunting for a man of his advanced age, he explained. He was now well into his 90s. In a gesture of great generosity, he invited me to take on the manuscript, to bring it to completion, and to make whatever changes I might see fit. It goes without saying that I accepted. I was acutely aware of the great debt that we all owe to Bernard Riley. And to my knowledge, he never discovered that I was one of those annoying external readers. His work certainly belongs to a different generation, notably in terms of its approaches to gender and power. But it is no less valuable for that fact. After all, we're all links in a trans-historical chain. All of our writing will inevitably be questioned by the next generation. And in my case, some of it has already been questioned by the next generation. Just in passing, it was very amusing to me to see my first book being described in a recent publication as traditional history, the foil for the new generation of graduate students. E.H. Carr gave prominence to this fact on the very first page of his book, What is History?, citing the 17th century specialist, Professor Sir George Clarke. Historians expect their work to be superseded again and again. They consider that knowledge of the past has come down through one or more human minds, has been processed by them, and therefore cannot consist of elemental or impersonal atoms that nothing can alter. As I read into Riley's manuscript, unwieldy and in some ways problematic as it was, there was something in particular which appealed to me, the northwestern Galician dimension of his embryonic project. And to contextualize this, it may be worth a step back. Bernard Riley had always retained fond memories of his very first archival visit to Spain in the fall of 1964, and of Santiago de Compostela in particular. He spent several weeks in what he describes as this lovely little town on the medieval street, which is now known as the Rua Nova. There were, of course, practical challenges. In the 1960s, as he later recalled, Spanish archives were in a lamentable condition. Wars, he says, civil discord, and general political repression had left Iberian archives in the most dreadful state, and the publication of their contents at a level scarcely above that of the 18th century España Sagrada volumes. To work there meant, he says, breathtaking discoveries, alongside institutional frustrations, tedium, bad lighting, and insufficient heat. Having reckoned with these challenges, though, gradually developing familiarity with Castilian, Leonese, and Galician archives, he completed his doctoral thesis in the year of my birth. I'm not going to tell you which year that was. The nature of church reform at Santiago de Compostela during the episcopate of Don Diego Gelmírez, 1100 to 1140 AD. One of the ways in which I've tried to reconstruct Riley's intellectual path is through his unpublished letters, which he bequeathed to the Hispanic Society of America in Manhattan, upper Manhattan, really, Washington Heights. It's one of the great jewels of New York City, and much overlooked. I believe I was the first person to look at his letters, and my great gratitude goes to John O'Neill, who is the curator of rare books and manuscripts. In his correspondence with his mentor, Charles Julian Bishko of the University of Virginia, Galicia was always a central theme. When Riley sent a passage on Bishop Gelmírez and Count Raymond of Burgundy from his recently completed thesis, Bishko responded, as you can see on this screen, responded appreciatively. Riley's thesis, he says, was a most illuminating analysis, altogether convincing in its emphasis upon Gelmírez's heavily Gallegan background. He agreed, Bishko agreed, with Riley's skepticism towards other scholarly efforts to interpret the bishop as a Francophile. He was equally praising towards Riley's article on Santiago and Saint-Denis, which he received in advance of publication and thought was beautifully done. He saw it as successfully underscoring Gelmírez's thoroughly regional and royal, as against trans-Pyrenean, connections. For his part, Riley would always insist on the strength of the autochthonous traditions of the northwest of the peninsula, although he suggested that he had little time for Celtic readings of Galician history, of a kind which is, of course, central to modern Galician nationalism. And this actually is a position which you can see being explained in this letter from 1971 to Marcia Kolish, who was at Oberlin College. And he is essentially expressing his skepticism towards the tradition or the existence of a tradition of Celtic or Basque separatism. It's very interesting to me to think about what would have been in the political air in the year 1971, presumably a year of intense ETA activity and repression of Basque terrorism in Francoist Spain, presumably also a moment of rising Galician nationalism, which I will come back to later in this talk. Riley was always convinced that the study of individuals in the historical past was an ethical obligation. In his memoirs, he describes it as an act of faith and an act of filial piety. He was drawn to the study of prominent men and women in their political context to the biographical mode. He wrote, "If one accepts the proposition that every human being is destined to have an infinite, eternal existence," an interesting theological proposition, then the chronicle of her or his life deserves attention. His first book, A Study of the Reign of Queen Urraca, ruler from 1109 to 26, and we will shortly be commemorating the 900th anniversary of her death, was followed fairly quickly by a second project on Urraca's father, Alfonso VI of León, Castilla. Riley had completed the initial draft of that manuscript by the fall of 85, and it was published 3 years later as the Kingdom of León, Castilla under King Alfonso VI. This second monograph was again well regarded, earning the inaugural Premio del Rey Prize of the American Historical Association in 1990. And it was followed by a third retinal study on the reign of the Emperor, Imperator, Alfonso VII. The latest book was written with a keen sense of the need to explore the geography, the physical and cultural terrain, which shaped Alfonso VII's reign, to carry out research in what is sometimes known as the archive of the feet. He says, I needed to tread the paths, appraise the cities, gauge the mountains, and look at the likely streams that would facilitate or obstruct the king's movements and dictate his stratagems. So a very keen sense of the need to appreciate and understand the physical topography. On the eve of the publication of Alfonso VII, Riley's good friend Joseph O'Callaghan had written, and this is another letter in the Hispanic Society, had written with an interesting inquiry. One could say, O'Callaghan wrote, one could say that you stand like a colossus atop a solid century's worth of León, Castile. The question now is, do you go backwards or forwards in time? I would think Fernando I would be a likely target. As Riley later explained, the project as he envisioned it could not have been written at that stage. A critical edition of the documents of Fernando I only appeared in 1987, for example. The task took time and further painstaking research and synthesis. Meanwhile, Professor Riley had become very conscious of his advancing years. And so early in 2018, he wrote the letter kindly inviting me to take on this final project, which he had provisionally entitled Fernando I and the Resurgence of Christian Iberia, 1037 to 1065, to develop it further and to bring it to completion. The resulting book, I'm happy to say, was published last summer, 2024. And although I have modified it rather a lot in various ways, it still, I think and hope, enshrines some of his core convictions, among them his very firm view that Fernando was focused on the Iberian Northwest. He insisted in a letter to me on the surprisingly secondary importance of Castile in Fernando's thinking. And I quote, my own work points up the extreme concentration of Fernando on matters that we would call Galician or especially Portuguese. The king's Portuguese campaigns correspondingly play a significant role in this book, as does Galicia. On Castile, Riley was clear. The affairs of Castile are important, but peripheral. I love that line. When he interests himself in them, it is as a hired mercenary of Muslim Toledo, or through the agency of his son, Sancho. Even that was a bit strong for me, the hired mercenary of Toledo. It will not be until the shock of the Almoravid invasion, continued Riley, that his successors will have to focus their energies on the Transduero, hence Castile, and Palencia. Riley's constant concerns, in his own words, were with the difficult Bishop Cresconio of Santiago de Compostela, and Fernando's primary concern, in his words, were with the affairs of Galicia, Portugal, rather than with his father's kingdom, this is Sancho III, of Aragon, Pamplona, and indeed the entirely secondary influence of his own countship in Castile. He was, it seems to me, wrote Riley, a more traditional ruler of the kingdom of Asturias, Leon. And there, I think, is a little terminological difference between us, Asturias, Leon. I have emphasized the word Galicia in the title of this book and in many of the chapters of the book. But we both agree that Riley, just as Riley was insistent, proto-crusading sentiments were very limited in Iberia in the middle of the 11th century. In a later letter to me from the summer of 2018, he explained that the supposed turn to Cluny and the French interest proves to have been much overdone. His reign was dedicated largely to the consolidation of the crown's traditional lands in Asturias, Leon, and Galicia. The chief endeavour of his reign was the addition of the territories of Portugal down so far as Coimbra. And here on the screen is a map which I prepared in collaboration with Jonathan Greenlee, who is known to many people on social media as the surprised eel historian. He is a historian of eels, the river creature whose interest, one might suspect, is limited, but as far as John is concerned, it is in fact limitless. Anyway, we worked together on this map, and one of our principal concerns, one of my principal concerns, which John was happy to help me to visualize, one of my concerns was to eliminate the normal frontier between Christianity and Islam, to erase and downplay that sort of cartographical monument to crusading and to reconquest. And similarly, the map is intended to downplay the existence of frontiers of any kind and fixed territorial boundaries of any kind. One of my principal convictions, along with many historians working on this period, is that frontiers were not conceived in the same way that they would be from the 12th and 13th centuries, that this was a stage in which loyalty to a king rather than loyalty to a territory was paramount. So in this map and the following map, which focuses on the north and west of the peninsula, we have endeavored to downplay the normal visualization of space in the peninsula and the normal emphasis on frontiers. To reflect Bernard Riley's own conviction in the significance of Galicia, and also to avoid any appearance of celebrating Christian resurgence, to refer to the term which appeared in his original title, I retitled the book, giving prominence to Galicia. My hope was that the current title of the book, Leon and Galicia under Queen Sancha and King Ferdinando I, will also downplay the focus on the singular role of the king, because, as we'll probably talk about later, it does appear to be important to recognize monarchy as a corporate collective phenomenon in which queens and royal women were also central. In any case, the title emphasizes Galicia, which in the mid-11th century was surely one of the most economically productive parts of the territories in which Sancha and Fernando ruled, as well as one of the most densely populated, even if the degree of urbanization was extremely modest. Galicia was widely perceived in this period as a lucrative, prosperous region. Increasing amounts of land fell under cultivation in this area between the 9th and 11th centuries, as I'm sure Katarina would also emphasize, following a pattern of settlements that was both dense and diffuse, focused on small aldeas. Galicia was an important theatre of royal and aristocratic, as well as ecclesiastical activity. And it was the arena for continuing power struggles between the elites who dominated this territory. The delicate question of what to call this space in which Sancha and Fernando operated, and which I've slightly avoided up until this point, is delicate and complex, not least because of the multiple discursive contexts of this period. Our book adopts the composite term Leon and Galicia to refer to this realm, this space, while recognizing that the reverse order, Galicia and Leon, may also be legitimate. I've discovered to my cost that talking about this in Galicia is a political minefield. But the singular term Kingdom of Leon, which is not used in this period, arguably erases the fundamental importance of Galicia, in which several 11th century monarchs had deep roots and broad networks. The terminology of private charters and royal charters was flexible and inconsistent. Scribal traditions differed from one region to another. So it really is complex. And I'm under no illusions that this book will put an end to the debate. Journey, if I may, if you could all make sure that your microphones are turned off, that would be very helpful. Thank you. So we are journeying towards the far north of objective truth, but the landscape is shifting and disorienting. It resists our attempts at intellectual mapping. Riley's own position, which I have tried to honor in this book, was gently and implicitly political. A self-conscious attempt to deflect attention away from Castile, away from centralist historiography, to exorcise the spectral presence of Francoism and Scythian crusading, Viviano, to inhabit a new truth in which the geographical Northwest was pivotal. In our new book, facts are re-embedded in new value systems, new patterns of meaning, moving us back towards that conceptual North-Northwest, between the two poles of cold northern fact, to use E.H. Carr's turn of phrase, and the necessary reassertion of subjective values. And there are at least two factors that help to move the needle, two forms of subjectivity which inevitably enter the equation. The first of them is Galician nationalism. This year, 2025, is the Anno de Castelao in Galicia. And in the field of medieval history, the resurgent political force of Galleguismo has found expression in many recent articulations of the medieval past, including this book by my friends Anselmo López Carreira and José Miguel Andrade, O Reino Medieval de Galicia, Crónica de una Desmemoria, came out several years ago. This is a book, as you can tell, which addresses the marginalization and erasure of the medieval history of Galicia in the 19th and 20th centuries, a history which they observe was central to European and not just peninsular culture. Now, abbreviating slightly, I just want to say that their intellectual impulse is, in my view, an absolutely necessary counterbalance to past erasures. The subordination of the Galician language within Spain is a matter of urgent concern, and I am very sympathetic to their attempts to reverse this trend. There are, at the same time, there are some empirical problems and limitations in this attempt to retell and re-narrate the medieval past from the perspective of modern Galician nationalism. One of them is a very widespread emphasis on the eternal existence of a kingdom of Galicia, which I think may run into some problems, including the problem to which I have alluded, the fact that in the 11th century at least, there seems to be a lack of references, in my sources at least, to a kingdom of anything. There is instead an emphasis on personal loyalties, loyalty to rulers, rather than loyalty to territories, loyalty to a kingdom of Galicia, for example. So there are issues that are unresolved. Nevertheless, to the extent that Galician nationalism does represent a framework for democratic, pluralist, and feminist values, it is an essential component in the historian's craft. And my brief reference to feminist impulses here brings us to a second value system which also exerts an important force on us in our efforts to retell the story of this period, gender and power. The ethical imperative to give centrality to royal women is continuing to generate some of the best and most exciting scholarship in our field. I'm currently teaching in an undergraduate class this excellent book, Femina, subtitled A New History of the Middle Ages, through the women written out of it. Janina Ramirez writes in her preface, I'm not rewriting history, I'm shifting the focus, but the distinction is not entirely persuasive. And I rather suspect that she is rewriting history in the best possible way. A more specialized text, Lucy Pick's Her Father's Daughter, has been a guiding light, a pole star, so to speak, in my own efforts to re-envision the reign of Fernando and Sancha. Lucy has shown persuasively how, in Leon and Galicia, queens had long been recognized as having a vital role as spiritual guardians for the royal family, exerting authority through their ownership of religious houses. A wealth of new scholarship on queenship, gender and power in medieval Iberia underscores the importance of elite women. And one of its main proponents, Miriam Shardis, I hope has been able to join us today via Zoom. Sancha, it is worth noting in passing, was granddaughter of the Galician Count Menendo González, who ruled in the region of Portugal, rooting her origins firmly in the Iberian Northwest. She was raised in northern Galicia near the town of Betanzos, and it was she whose lineage enabled the thoroughly ruthless and I think rather unpleasant Fernando I to claim legitimate authority. Her political importance after Fernando's violent accession to power may be reflected in the fact that she is mentioned as co-grantor of a number of royal diplomas. The fact that she was daughter of King Afonso V, Afonso V, is often made explicit. There are nonetheless points where the limitations of the evidence do raise some questions. The taciturn brevity of the diplomas makes it difficult, for me at least, to know to what extent she really exerted any political agency. And to the extent that she, like Fernando, appears to have favored the monastery of Sahagún above all others, raises the question as to whether an emphasis on the far northwest, on Galicia, is in some sense a rhetorical sleight of hand. In the end, the sources do not allow us to state very much about Sancha with empirical certainty. They do not allow us to tack very north, very far to the pole of northern truth, to return to E.H. Carr's metaphor. And I've actually been asked to write a biography of Sancha specifically for a Galician press with a deadline of November 2025. So I'm wrestling with these issues in a very immediate sense and wondering about how we write the history of a clearly very powerful Galician queen on whom the textual sources are often frustratingly limited. Do we replicate the silence of our textual sources? To what extent do we engage in the kind of imaginative speculation which has been attempted by a number of great historians, including Natalie Zeman Davis, and on the right of this image, Susan Whitfield for the medieval Silk Road? To what extent is speculation a legitimate tool for writing about medieval women who have been written out of the story for queens such as Sancha? So this is a question which I'm endeavoring to wrestle with. I would point out in passing that there is, thankfully, an enormous and really promising new thesis, which I received a copy of this morning by Pilar Recio at the Complutense in Madrid, approaching the figure of Sancha from the perspective of art history. So hopefully this will be a very important contribution to the study of the reign. Now, in the next and I think penultimate part of this talk, I want to return to relatively empirically solid ground. in talking about the Northwest in the 13th century. Just to explain these images briefly, on the left is a reconstruction of the Romanesque choir of Maestre Mateo, which is an image from a project being conducted by Francisco Prado Vilar at the Universidad de Santiago de Compostela. I think a rather wonderful image which reminds us of the extremely vivid colors of the medieval imagination and of this Romanesque masterpiece. On the right, historical landmark, a collection of essays edited by James D'Amelio, which appeared with Brill a few years ago and really is a point of reference for our field. And I did want to say that, as James D'Amelio himself observed in the introduction to this book, which is a 100-page introduction, this period, the 13th and 12th centuries, was among the most dynamic periods in the history of Galicia. So much as historians have often attempted to suggest that Galicia becomes increasingly peripheral in this period, there is a lot of evidence for its continuing centrality. Alfonso VII, for example, wished to be buried in Santiago as his father had been and to create a royal pantheon there. In the wake of the division of the realms in 1157, Galicia continued to exert very considerable weight within what is often known misleadingly as the Kingdom of Leon. Although Fernando II rarely visited Galicia in person after 1172, his successor, Alfonso, did so frequently, and he created the position of Marino Mayor. Now, I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to accelerate a little bit through this part of the talk. But you'll have noticed I did not give Alfonso a number. Alfonso, King of Leon and Galicia in the late 12th century, is normally numbered Alfonso IX. But as Galician historians are keen to observe, he was in fact the 8th king of that name to rule in Leon and Galicia, which means that the wise king Alfonso X, El Sabio, should in fact be Alfonso IX. And you'll just seen I've included a little slide of everyone's hero, Winston Churchill, because in 1953, this question of numerating monarchs, which is a real can of worms, was discussed in Parliament. And the question here was whether Elizabeth II, recently crowned, should indeed be considered Elizabeth II in Scotland, because there had never been an Elizabeth I in Scotland. And Churchill observed in speaking to Parliament, as the great scroll of history unfolds, many complicated incidents occur, which it is difficult to introduce effectively into the pattern of the likes and dislikes of the epoch in which we live. I couldn't agree more. So this question of enumeration has surfaced more recently. But to come back to the core of the matter, and hoping you will excuse the reference here to Alfonso X, which may be problematic. It is true that after 1230, Galicia found itself absorbed within a much larger kingdom, which dramatically expanded, of course, with the conquests of Cordoba, Sevilla, and the Kingdom of Murcia. Fernando III was clearly preoccupied with the campaigns on the Andalusi frontier. This is a map which appeared in the original English language version of my book, The Wise King. But it is also clear that Alfonso, whether we call him the 9th, the 10th, or simply El Sabio, had close personal connections with Galicia, dating back to his childhood and his youth. His guardian was married to Doña Mayor Arias, who was probably a Galician noblewoman, and so on and so forth. He probably had extensive contacts with, as a young man, with noble courts from the Minho region in which a troubadour lyric was being cultivated, and this may well go some way towards explaining his adoption of Galician as the language of lyric poetry. So, we could point to a variety of very early personal contacts that Alfonso has with Galicia. It may also have been in Galicia that in 1239 he began his relationship with a woman named Maria Afonso, and he would have received a number of important towns in the region as a tenant, including Rivadavia and possibly Lemos in the 1240s. So all of this would have, in fact, consolidated a sense of personal investment in the region. I wanted also to show you this version of the map. This is a draft of a Galician language version of the map, which is still in the process of production. There will be, I'm very happy to say, a Galician translation and adaptation of the book coming out in a few months with the University of Santiago de Compostela Press, and an artist in Santiago, Martinho Picayo, is currently working with me to produce this Galician version of the map. So I'll just leave this on the screen, although it does contain a number of errors which we are currently very much in the process of correcting. In fact, I think we finally produced the final version today. So against this background, I will acknowledge that the wise king, Alfonso el Sabio, never went as king to Galicia. He demonstrated an overwhelming personal preference for the south and especially for Seville. But personal preference was very different from political, economic, and military strategy, and Galicia was never far from his thoughts. Alfonso was significantly more concerned with addressing Galician affairs than his father had been. The crown continued to have major interests in Galicia in the 13th century and continued to exert authority over the delegation of royal jurisdiction to powerful aristocratic tenants there. Among the most powerful tenants, the most prominent tenants in Galicia were members of the great families like the Traba, the Limia, and the Castro families. They also included Alfonso's firstborn son, Alfonso Fernandez el Niño, who would be Lord of Trastámara and Montenegro in the 1260s. Physical distance from Galicia, which did become increasingly characteristic of later medieval Castilian rulership, didn't necessarily mean that these rulers were unconcerned with the Iberian northwest. Galicia remained vital in many respects. Galicians, like Cantabrians, were involved in military campaigns on the Andalusian frontier and the process of resettlement and colonization. People like Esteban Fernández de Castro. Galicia and Cantabria were also important sources of revenue designed to support Alfonso's candidacy for the imperial title. The northern coasts had an economically central role and were increasingly subject to Alfonso's legislative framework. This meant the creation of customs houses in numerous Galician and Cantabrian ports in places like Ortigueira, Tedeira, Ferrol, and Pontedeume. All of which is to say that the geographical northwest continued to pull its political weights for the economy and for the culture of the Alphonsine realms. It was by no means a moribund periphery. And so the new Galician translation of my book, The Wise King, is intended partly as an intervention, an inflection or a deflection of old Castilian-centric narratives. Like our study of Sancho, it is also a book inflected by new understandings of the role of royal women, in this case, like Queen Violante. And my decision in the Galician translation of the book to use a non-Castilian version of her name, Yolanda, is further intended to signal the internationalism and cosmopolitanism of the royal court, to respect the cultural origins of foreign-born queens and to complicate the homogenizing pressures of Galician nationalism. But now, some conclusions. The kind welcome that you've offered me may well be running out. So it only remains to me to ask, is this account of the importance of the North-Northwests in the 11th-13th centuries historically true? In the sense that it embeds facts into fabrics of meaning, I hope that it does veer somewhere towards the conceptual North-Northwest, never violating a careful interpretation of the empirical evidence, while also remaining true to the dimensions of the past and present that we value. The concept of values is never more important than now, at a time when so much of our world, to quote Hamlet, appears to be out of joint, haunted by the ghosts of the past, including the ghosts of fascist authoritarianism, hell-bent on the destruction of both truth and democratic values. If I'm returning here partly to E.H. Carr's metaphor of the two poles in What is History, I'm also paying homage to a less well-known work of theory by Beverly Southgate, What is History For? In the past, Southgate suggests, it was widely assumed that the capital T truth just lay there, deeply entombed in archives, awaiting discovery and the kiss of life by worthy, knight-errant historians. But, says Southgate, in the postmodern world, we must adopt a more pragmatic notion of lowercase truth. A truth, he says, that has no ultimate external reference, but serves satisfactorily for human purposes in a particular context. History is inevitably for something, Southgate argues. Our only choice lies in determining what social, political, or personal function it will serve. In my view, history needs to serve now as one of the most urgent means for maintaining a democratic, pluralist, feminist society. This doesn't necessarily mean that all of us need to write left-of-centre history. While keeping track of the pole star, some of us will head northwest, others may head northeast. But all of us should keep moving because nothing is more important than constantly rewriting history. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon, for the delightful conference that you gave us. So I will jump in and try to see our now we are seeing the people.
We can see them, although people are now invisible.
Yes.
If people would like to de-invisibilize themselves,
yes,
it's always reassuring. Hello.
Please, if you can, por favor, liguem as vossas câmaras para vos podermos ver. Nós entramos agora num período em que podemos fazer aqui alguma discussão, algumas perguntas que queiram colocar ao Simon. É um momento para fazer, mesmo em casa, levantem a mão e nós vamos dando voz a todos. E, portanto, por favor, quem quiser fazer perguntas, comece a inscrever.
Yes, of course, I do welcome any questions from those of you who are able to be here today and those of you who are unable to attend in person.
So I have many questions.
Good.
So,
yes.
Okay.
Please.
Claro, Miguel, sim.
So thank you very much. It was really fascinating. And I'd like to ask you a question about the dynastic issue in the 12th century. Because we Portuguese are very used to hear about our royal house being of Burgundian origin because of Count Henry. But if we look at the sources at the time, we find that there's no evidence of his Burgundian origins. In fact, the sources only speak about his parenting to Raymond, said to be cousins. But all the sources of the 12th and the 13th century, when they speak about King Alfonso's origins, they all say that what matters really is his mother. And of course, they can perfectly trace his mother's origin, and that's what counts. And even when Count Dom Pedro himself writes at the end of the 13th century his livre de lignage, well, he has absolutely lost origins, the memory of the origin of Count Henry, and he tells that he is of Hungarian origin. So I would like to ask you, could that kind of option be another dimension of this Galician centrality that you spoke about?
Well, I'm going to, the question, I'm not quite sure whether everyone online can also hear the questions from the audience, but the question is about...
They hear, yeah, hear.
They can hear, good.
Okay.
Essentially, I'm going to dodge the question by acknowledging the very important work being done by my North American colleague in the field, Miriam Shardas. I think Miriam would be the best person to address this question because she is precisely working on the importance of queenship in the emergence of the early Portuguese kingdom. And I think what you're implying is absolutely in line with what she is suggesting and what she will publish. So with apologies for dodging the question directly, I think that the question would be best answered by Miriam, in fact. Sure.
Okay. More questions? Or comments if you want to discuss about what history is for. You are invited to. You are a historian, so.
And if not, Katarina, I think your many questions.
Yes, let me. Yes, let me start. Okay, so you argue that Fernando I and Sancho, Fernando I, his main focus was Galicia and also obviously Portugal. What was not Portugal at the time, but the territory that we name Portugal. Why do you argue that? Because all their actions were regarding to this territory, or there are many other clues related with that?
Yes, I think it has to do with their actions, with their sphere of geographical movements, with their patronage. Of course, it does need to be acknowledged that they have a very awkward relationship with the Bishop of Santiago, with Cresconio. So that relationship is not a good one. But nonetheless, in terms of military actions, in terms of campaigns, in terms of their spheres of influence, in terms of their cultural orientations, and so forth, their preoccupation does indeed appear to be with Galicia far more than with Castile. And Castile is delegated from an early stage to Sancho. They travel remarkably infrequently to the Castilian frontier. So while there may be a danger of overstating the case, I think that both Riley and I were concerned with redressing the balance and with with providing an antidote to Castilian-centric narratives about their reign.
Okay. I had other questions, but let me see if someone else wants to question.
You may raise your hands, or
you can talk.
Please talk. Yes.
Yes, we can talk.
Also, those of you in the audience may raise your hands or talk. So, of course, I was attempting to do something in this talk which combines both my principal recent projects, the Wise King project, which is also a current project, and in writing the Galician adaptation, I have indeed attempted to give more weight to the Northwest than was present in the original English language version, which was very much focused on Seville and on his cultural debt to Al-Andalus. That it was the debt to Al-Andalus and the importance of Al-Andalus in catalyzing the 12th century and 13th century Renaissance, which was integral to the original book. In the Galician adaptation, I have very much attempted to integrate the Northwest in a way that also speaks to the interests which we explored in the book, which I still often call the Riley book, the Riley project. So the talk, of course, was intended both to address the importance of the geographical Northwest and to get at something which I continue to wrestle with, which is the extent to which our field should be, needs to be, can be responsive to our contemporary moments. And when we were passing, we saw the signs of previous symposia here at the Institute addressing the relevance of the medieval past. And I was talking to you about the way in which in my previous work, I have struggled with the question of what medieval Iberia can tell us about the relationship between faiths, the relationship between Christianity and Islam and Judaism. And this question became extremely pressing, particularly pressing, of course, after 9/11, after March 11th, 2004 in Spain. So for a number of years, I thought, and many of us thought in North America and Spain and elsewhere, about what our field can offer to the discussion of contemporary events and contemporary concerns. And now we find ourselves in another crisis in North America and in the West. And again, I think we need to ask, what can we offer? What do we offer at this moment of perhaps unprecedented crisis in the academy, when there is, in fact, an assault, not just on medieval history, not just on history, but on the humanities, and in fact on the universities. When Donald Trump and perhaps some of his European acolytes are launching an all-out attack on the university as such, what is our role? And in thinking about the direction in which we want to go, of course, I was using the metaphor of compass points. Do we aim for a kind of objective due north of untarnished empirical fact, or do we respond to something that I call values? Do we respond, do we embrace the subjectivity of our positions in this moment of crisis? I think that we cannot remain neutral at this moment. I think it is very dangerous to remain neutral. We are not facing a neutral enemy. And so I'm looking in this, I have been looking today in this talk, and I continue to look in my other work for an answer to this question of how we respond to this extraordinarily dangerous moment. And I'm not sure whether any of you have thoughts on this, because I would welcome your own responses to that question. I think it's a question that will inflect the rest of our careers. Of course, looking around the room, we're at different stages of our careers, but we live in a moment which will undoubtedly be transformational.
Yes, there is there is a moment that we are turning now,
Mhm.
and we are living
Absolutely.
that. It's true. It's
It's
true.
an
and
inflection
what
point.
what our role is in this. And
Yes, that's right. What is history for at a moment when history is quite clearly being deliberately erased? There is quite clearly an ideological erasure of the past, which is integral to the attack on facts and expertise.
And why do you think it happens? Why do we erase history and certain moments of our history, our collective history, for the political purposes of today?
Well, that's a good question, and of course, I'm thinking in large part about the situation in North America, although there are close parallels in Europe. I think about the difference that may exist between the history of right-wing Spanish movements in the 20th and 21st centuries and their use of the past. I know Alicia Miguelez has worked on this and talks and written on this issue. And I think about the use of el Cid, for example, by the Franco regime and the co-option of a medieval past by the Franco regime. It is, let's say, an exercise in selective memory, which was being carried out, and I dare say there were close Portuguese equivalents. But in the United States, the situation is a little different because the historical moment to which our current president wishes to return is extraordinarily nebulous. Make America great again. But no one can name the historical moment to which he is referring. And that, I think, is because there is no moment to which he is referring. He is referring to a moment that does not exist. And in a certain sense, the Trumpist movement relies upon the erasure of all historical memory, whereas the Francoist moment, the Franco regime, depended on selective memory and a very precise co-option of specific historical figures, including el Cid and including Philip II. The Trumpist memory requires erasure. It occupies a completely ahistorical space in which historians are finding analogies and seeing analogies that the Trump regime clearly wishes to erase. So the suggestion last week that there be a forced displacement of peoples to a new territory clearly brings to mind, for anyone familiar with North American history, brings to mind the forced displacement of indigenous people in North American history. History, therefore, is a danger to the regime. To remember history is to remember suffering. To remember history is, of course, to engage in an exercise of compassion and empathy. History teaches us compassion and empathy. And complexity, but also the brutal simplicity, to be honest, the brutal simplicity of genocide. And so there is a vested interest in the erasure of all of those things. There's a vested political interest in the erasure of history, medieval and otherwise.
But then the right-wing politicians of Europe and North America, they are not looking at history with the same eyes. They are looking different things, and they are raising, or they are choosing parts of the history. They are more connected with their intentions in terms of politics.
Mm-hmm.
But then when we see all together, and we know this is happening, and they are supporting each other across Europe and North America, we can see that their objectives mainly are the same. because they are territorial, they are imperialists, they want to make things great again,
Mhm.
and then they will clash, because that's the history. When someone has pretension to expand influence and territory and so on, they will clash with each other. So they are not, I don't know, we could see this, but at the same time, I don't think they are seeing that. So
Right.
it is a very strange situation that we are looking at the same time.
It is.
And quickly situation,
Yes.
because it's going to very fast.
Yes.
happening
I
very
mean,
fast.
you know, obviously this week's news, and I do want to come back to Galicia in a second, by the way, but this
And
week's
to
news.
Fernando, I have a
perhaps
question
to
about Fernando.
But of course, you know, there are two Galicias, of course. The other one is in northwestern Iberia, the other one is in eastern Ukraine. And this week's news has clearly brought to one's mind the spectre of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pacts of 1939.
Yeah.
So, you know, one is confronted with the constant question of the exact extent to which we are replicating history, and 20th century specialists are hopefully becoming engaged in this issue. We may not be precisely replicating history, but perhaps history is rhyming. To return to Galicia, of course, much of what I was doing in this talk today was also to answer not just a Francoist vision of medieval peninsular history, but to address and respond to a vision of peninsular history which is being articulated by the far right in Spain today, by Vox. And we are living in a year in which, for the first time, the Galician language is now spoken by less than 50% of the population of Galicia. So therefore, it is a particularly important moment to publish in Galician, to speak about the centrality of Galicia for the history, which Vox claims to be celebrating the history of the medieval peninsula. Abascal just last week referred to the Reconquest. Of course, it's a long-standing trope.
As a Reconquest.
As Reconquest.
Yeah.
Yes, the Reconquest of Spain from woke ideology. So, you know, to the extent that he is co-opting medieval history, it becomes incumbent upon us again to engage from a different perspective, from a different compass point with that history. You know, we cannot continue. And I'm going to quote a line from an article that appeared in Speculum, in the journal Speculum in 1953. The author wrote, "We cannot continue our academic busy work while the world goes to ruin." And this was a medievalist called E.N. Johnson, writing in 1953 against the backdrop of the Cold War and the emergence of nuclear weapons as a potentially apocalyptic technological development. So Ian Johnson in 1953 wrote in the pages of Speculum a really wonderful article, which I recommend to all of you, about how we tell the story of the past in a way that responds to our contemporary moment, whether it's the Cold War or whether it's the rise of right-wing regimes for the first time since the Second World War. And, you know, E.M. Johnson suggested that we look with new eyes at emergence of pacifist movements in the Middle Ages, that we look also at the roots of contemporary clashes between East and West in the Middle Ages and between Christianity and Islam in the Middle Ages. Some of the specific issues that he pinpointed more than half a century ago remain important in our own world, but there are others which are new. And I do just think that we have a collective responsibility for engaging. for engaging with our current moments in a way that, of course, remains loyal to empirical truth to the fullest extent possible. And it's always a very delicate balance. This is my image of the needle moving. How do we keep veering towards the north of absolute truth while also heading in a productive political direction?
Yeah. You all have a role in that, in thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
And acting.
And acting. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
acting. Well,
it was interesting to me. It was very interesting to me, by the way. I'm happy to take more questions, but until people begin to kick and scream and shout, it was very interesting for me to realize and discover somewhat unexpectedly Riley's own political position, because of course he belonged to a generation which did largely separate his political inclinations from his academic writing. One would never guess from his academic writing that he was so vehemently hostile to US policy. So he did not belong to a generation that was accustomed to sort of marrying politics with scholarship. But as I was suggesting in the talk, I think there are ways in which his explicit determination to reclaim the importance of the Northwest was implicitly a response to Francoism, to that moment when he had first encountered the archive. So he was implicitly engaging in a political act.
Well, engaging with that, I have to, and one question, why, in your opinion, the relation between Galicia and Franco, because he was a Galician, wasn't it? So why they have this so difficult relation, avoiding the Galician as a language and so on? Why it happens? Do you have an idea? What is so difficult for Franco to have a relation with his own lands?
Not just Franco, right? I mean, there is a fine tradition, fine and ongoing tradition of conservative Galician leaders who have a complex relationship with Galician and with the kind of cultural autonomy of their own nation. I hesitated over using that word, but of course, one part of the answer has to do with the specific politics of Ferrol, where Franco was from, and of course, Galicia is a politically very divided culture and country. The landscape continues to be very politically divided. So the forces of centralism, the forces of Castilian philia continue to be strong in some parts of Galicia, and they certainly would have been strong in the 1940s and 50s. In that sense, I suppose neither Franco nor Feijóo nor Rueda nor anyone else but Fraga were entirely unexpected. But there is a very important, as you well know, there's a very important other sector of Galician society which is anxious to make its presence felt and perhaps to also correct misunderstandings of their Galician past. One misunderstanding of the Galician past in terms of 20th century history is the presumption that Galicia, being a conservative backwater, sort of rolled over easily and gave up to and surrendered to Francoism very quickly in 1936. That is a misunderstanding. There was, as you may well know, intense opposition to Francoism from within Galicia and intense repression. The airport in Santiago de Compostela was built with prisoner of war labor, as will be a subject of a talk this Friday in Santiago de Compostela, if anyone finds themselves in that neck of the woods. So I think there is a whole sector of Galician society which would like to make its presence felt, which would like to reclaim the history of this region from the more conservative and often more powerful voices.
I could talk more and ask. I have more questions for Simon, but please, if you have to, I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
I would say, but the conversation went on, so what I'm about to say is not so bright idea, but something that makes the exercise of the historian making history fascinating. One of the first steps is to understand that everything that when you pick a subject, you will always find that it has some political connotations and it has a political background, further or not so further back as gaining the political connotations or not. But that's the interesting part. Like today we have an earthquake in Portugal. When we have an earthquake, the great historical figure that comes to mind is Marquês de Pombal, that rebuilt Lisbon. Marquês de Pombal is perhaps one of the figures that was most molded from the past to the present by ideological views, and it had a great debate in Portuguese historiography between those that made Marquês de Pombal a hero, and that were more connected. The Republicans made Marquês de Pombal a great hero. The more liberal, progressive monarchists made him an hero, a great enlightenment figure. And then we had the other part more concerned with the conservatives, the more traditional monarchies that made them a tyrant, that repressed the traditional way of being. And in the midst of all those, the real Martins or the real person, it's difficult now to understand them because we have all these layers. And like this example, we have a lot, and we spoke about a lot of them. And so this story, and it's always fascinating because we have all these layers coming our way, and we have to untangle, but always realizing that we also are a layer and will bring our own layers to it. And that is always fascinating. It's no idea, this is all of us know this, but it's really a fascinating thing when we realize, when we pick a subject and then we start to disentangle all the
Absolutely.
and we don't have to go to such like this case, you don't have to go to dictatorships or things like that. All methods will have their
yes, and of course, even our sources are embedded in systems of power.
Yeah.
And so there's no possibility of engaging in some kinds of intellectually pure apolitical exercise. The chronicles on which we rely are, of course, nothing if not political. And I wrote a little bit about this in my first book, the one that was described by a younger scholar as being traditional history. In my book on the Lara family, which is about an aristocratic family between the 11th and 14th centuries, I talked about the way in which historians have been generally primed to sympathize with centralized power, and primed ever since the production of pro-monarchical chronicles in the Middle Ages itself. So the trope of rapacious noblemen, the trope of somehow self-interested nobility like the Lara family is ubiquitous, not just in medieval chronicles, but also in modern historiography. As if the monarchy was not self-interested, as if the monarchy was not also rapacious. So it's not just very difficult, it is in fact impossible for us to step outside these different political discourses, these different discourses of power, which date back and are imprinted even in our original sources.
That was a question more related with the topic of Galician past that I wanted to make I recently finished my master thesis that was focused on the relationship between peasants and the nobility in northern Portugal in the frontier with Galicia. And one thing I realized, and this became quite an important subject for me, was that our historiography tends to look at the reality from the sources that I studied, that are the general inquiries, that were large surveys, that are wonderful sources to know the social reality of that place. Always looks with the eyes of tends to look with the eyes of the court, of the king. And so all those actions are like usurpations, and that tends to like the relationship established by the local powers, by the nobles or the peasants, were always many times are characterized based on the perspective of the king. Like those types of interaction or of action are like usurpation, and are described like this because it's if it's against the interest of the king, they are sometimes described as usurpation. So that was a question that I want to make you. That don't you find that sometimes or many times it's like almost embedded? When I started doing this, I realized no, we are having a perspective that is too kingocentric, let's say. And in Galicia, perhaps studying Galicia as it became like further away from the royal court, it's isn't it absolutely important or fundamental to have that, like Galicia was very like the north of Portugal, full of powers and cities, and like to be very careful not to be kingocentric, realizing these powers still there and they still make the life there.
Yes, it's important to avoid, as you say, being kingocentric in at least two ways, right? One is to avoid being excessively sympathetic to whoever the central power of the day may be. And that I think is the sense in which you were thinking of it. The other sense in which it's important to avoid being kingocentric is to avoid the great man view of history, the singular great male ruler, at the expense of all other members of the royal family. And it has, I think, now become orthodoxy among scholars of medieval monarchy, that at least in North America, that monarchy is a corporate collective enterprise. It's a very, very diffuse enterprise. And I'm reminded of Alfonso El Sabio, who has imprinted his name upon everything, has imprinted his name on the whole culture on the whole era of the age. Alfonso is really a shorthand, isn't it? The name Alfonso, as Jesus Rodriguez Velasco points out in an article, the name Alfonso is really code for a constellation of people, artists, creators, illuminators, and the many members of the royal courts who carried out this, who carried out the exercise of monarchy. There's a sense in which you might think of monarchy as a process, particularly in an early stage, more a process than an institution. So yes, I think we want to avoid kingocentrism. We want to avoid that in both senses of the term. Thank you for your observations. By the way, the last thing I want to say is that there is, in terms of your noble peasant relations, there is nonetheless a catch for those of us that want to kind of rescue, of course, that want to rescue the possibility of an aristocratic perspective in order to provide an antidote to monarchical perspectives. And the danger is that we end up, I was conscious of this, that we end up perhaps legitimizing a form of social exploitation to which we are not especially sympathetic either. I mean, so anxious was I to rescue the perspective of the Lara family that I worry about whether I ended up celebrating aristocracy more than I would have liked. So it's very difficult indeed to escape this kind of hall of mirrors, right?
But then you have the perspectives of the archaeologists. And I can say that I am very peasant focused. So the perspective of the peasants, because we learn more about peasants excavating, having their own stuff. But then we miss the link between aristocracies and peasants. Because there is a missing link, always is a missing link. And the question is how to read these all missing pieces and put it together. Maybe we can't, but to try to be more. And it's about that I want to ask you one more question. And going back to 11th century and to Fernando and that map that you show us on this.
Should we retrieve the map?
Yes, we can. We can go to the map again. This one, I think. No.
Earlier image.
This one.
Yes.
Yes. Let me share with people at home. Okay. This was the map. Let me put it like this. Yeah. Let's go back to this map. Okay. So, yes, I agree with you with this idea of borders. It's not a line. It's a state of mind, more or less. And in this moment, and to this area that you put it as a contact zones, because I work in this area specifically. And the question is, because you look at the documents from Fernando I and Sancha, and there is a question for me that's important, and I don't have a clear view on that, is regarded with the relations that the king had after the conquest of this area with locals. This is a very huge area, was not empty of people. And when it conquested, we know that Islamic power is there, but it's kind of blurred thing in some places, in some spots, Coimbra, obviously, but then further north it's not so clear. And what clues do you have in documents regarding to the relation of this action of Fernando in the conquest of these areas with people that were living there and mainly with local elites? And this connects directly to another idea that we know they start to jump on the documents, that's the inflections, this strange category, that's the inflections that start to appear in the documents.
Yes, you will have seen me hunting for something on the PDF on my screen here. I haven't been ignoring you. I'm looking for the part of the book which deals with Cisnando David, because I think he is an important part of the answer to your question. And although, so part of my answer has to be that the conquest of Coimbra happens extremely late in the story.
Yes, it's the finish of the.
It's the very end of the reign, and therefore, to a significant extent, the story that you're asking about is later than the period in which I have any expertise at all. But having said that, two things. One is I'm very pleased to have been able to show you this version of the map, in which the area in question is marked as contact zones. I'm pleased about that because, sadly, in the published version of the book, the penultimate version of the map appears, in which the contact zones appear as no man's land. And that is a phrase that I had really wanted to avoid. But it made it in by one of those sad email-related mistakes. So it is contact zones that we want to talk about and not no man's land. This absolutely, as you very well know, was not a no man's land. It was continuously inhabited. And the story which I'm glimpsing, and honestly, I think you should really be the person to answer your own question here, but the sense that I have is really that the story was one of continuity that there is not a moment of abrupt change when the conquest takes place. So Cisnando, who was already, as I understand it, part of a local elite, who had already been collaborating in a very fluid way with multiple external powers, whose religion might not have been the crucial factor. Cisnando is then immediately appointed as the person, or immediately allowed to remain as the person who continues to rule de facto after the conquest. So the story is one of continuity, and a very fluid continuity.
Yeah. So they knew who was there, who rules that places.
Yes, they knew, and as always, it is absolutely essential to work with those people who do have de facto control.
Yes. There is another way.
Pardon?
There is no way to rule a new area without that.
Particularly in this period, right? I mean, and I think this is the case in newly conquered Coimbra, but it's also the case in Galicia. It's also the case in Asturias. It's also the case in Leon, that the monarchy in general needs to work with aristocrats. Basically, monarchy in the 11th and 12th centuries especially needs to work through aristocracy at all stages. It has very little autonomous power. And indeed, there is a school of thought that essentially monarchy is the instrument of aristocratic networks, rather than the other way around. I know Julio Escalona has written about this. So I think there may be, I continue to believe that there is a shift in the 13th centuries. This is an issue of debate. There are new, there have been challenges to the position which I took, but my position continues to be actually that in the 13th century, there is a shift. The monarchy does become more interventionist, more centralizing in the 13th century, and that there is therefore from the 13th century a more confrontational relationship between the crown and the old nobility. But in this period, in the 11th and 12th centuries, the two are absolutely working hand in glove, aristocracy and monarchy. There is absolute symbiosis. Whether we consider the monarchy as an instrument of aristocratic networks, or whether we flip that equation and say that the monarchy always works through aristocracy, it's a completely symbiotic situation.
Okay. So, mais questões? So.
Perhaps, I'm sure at this stage, if not before, people are agreeing with the Charlton Heston sentiment, which I displayed on the screen, that this is too long. For those of you that have not yet seen the Kenneth Branagh version of Hamlet, I thoroughly recommend that you do. It's a wonderful exploration of many themes that are important to all of us, including perhaps both mental illness and certainly, as I was suggesting, political illness, the sickness of the state of Denmark. So, but thank you all. And Charlton Heston, despite his atrocious performance in Elfith, which I think should have been the end of his career, actually does a remarkably wonderful job in Hamlet as the king of the players, the play within the play. So if you haven't seen it, that is my parting recommendation for the day. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Simon. Muito obrigada, Simon.
Obrigado.
Foi maravilhoso, foi um momento maravilhoso. Temos pena não termos mais gente na sala, mas tive bastante gente a assistir. E pronto, teremos outros momentos. Obrigada a todos por estarem connosco. E estaremos provavelmente de volta na próxima conferência, talvez em maio. Voltaremos a encontrar-nos nas conferências do IEM. Obrigada a todos, and thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.